Hello everybody, I'm going to talk to you about your coursework, which is something that we would have been planning to do anyway over Easter, to get this going over Easter, so it's all business as usual. So in this 10-minute video, I'm going to talk you through everything you need to know about the coursework, how to get started on it, and so on. So some basic information to start off with. Over the course of the A-level, you'll do two coursework pieces. One's going to be on a novel and the other is on a set of poems, but we'll do that in year 2. And the idea is that we start it in the summer term of year 1, which is well timed in order to get cracking on reading a novel and making your notes over the summer period, and then we just sort of finish off the final draft early on in the autumn term. So yes, as I say, 2 pieces of coursework, and they're each worth 10%. So that your coursework is 20% in total, which is, if you do well, and normally my students have done very well in the past, and most of them have got into the top band with their coursework. So it just gives you a great deal of confidence going into the written exam, knowing that you've got a really good mark already under your belt. So for the prose NEA, the NEA just stands for non-examined assessment. So for the prose coursework, you can choose from 5 novels: Great Expectations, Charles Dickens; Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice; Bram Stoker's Dracula; Mary Shelley's Frankenstein; and George Orwell's 1984. We have given you these 5 texts to choose from because we've got a whole kind of library set up on SharePoint of useful critical material to take you through these texts, and all kinds of articles, interesting articles to help you. So we've done a lot of the research for you. We've got a library of materials for you to read, and because we as teachers all know these texts really, really well, it means that we can kind of hold your hand through it and guide you to producing a really good first and then second draft. So what we do with this piece of coursework is you're going to link it to the feminist section of the critical anthology, which you already have looked at previously this year, and we've been applying it, haven't we, to the poems and to Importance of Being Earnest here and there, and I'm sure you've been applying it to every now and again to Shakespeare as well, Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. So you're looking at this text through the lens of feminist critical ideas, and that is your angle. And all of the coursework titles are basically sort of centered on some of those ideas as well. So you can choose from a range of titles. If you look at the coursework at home booklet that's loaded up onto Teams, and it's also on SharePoint, there are a range of titles on each of the texts for you to choose from, or you can agree a different one with me if you don't like those. And the point with the NEA, the prose NEA, is that you get lots of one-to-one advice, lots of meetings with me to talk through your plan, your first draft. You get lots of feedback. I always give audio feedback and written feedback on the drafts, and it's actually perfect for remote learning. So it's all fitting in actually pretty well to our plan for the year anyway, this. So do not worry. And you can email me anytime to ask questions. So it's all going to be fairly easy and fairly straightforward. This is the usual Band 5 grade descriptor. We've got the perceptive and assured terminology there, which is something that everybody in H code and E code needs to be aiming for, and I know it's achievable for everybody to get into this band. So that's there for you to look at. It's also in the booklet on the coursework as well, so you might want to take a close look at that at some point. Here are some of the main feminist ideas from the critical anthology that you're going to apply to your text, and you just choose 2 or 3 of these that you think, or maybe 4, depending on how meaty they are. You just choose some of these to discuss in the light of your particular question. So, for example, some texts in the past by feminist critics have been criticised for just focusing on male protagonists and really just giving women marginal roles. And you might want to investigate that if you think it's relevant to your chosen text. You also might want to look at how acts that we usually think of as being sort of private acts end up being an extension of the public sphere. And you might want to apply that particular theory to your text as well, and see what that tells us about what life was like for women or even men in the time period in which your chosen novel is set. You also might want to look at the implicit presuppositions of the text that you're reading. It might assume that the reader is male, for example. It might have a very male perspective. So that might be something that you will want to look at as particularly relevant, I think, for Dracula. And then you might also want to have a think about how women are represented through stereotyping. You know and understand stereotypes, I think, very well by now, and so you might want to look at that in your chosen text. You also might want to try and consider what kind of angle is given to female independence, because sometimes in texts, female independence is given quite a negative slant. So those are just some of the many ideas that from the critical anthology that you can apply to the text. And it's basically answering the question that you've chosen, but weaving in some of these feminist ideas into your response. So, which novel should you choose? Well, Pride and Prejudice is a classic, and there's lots of brilliant films that are around and TV series. There's the lovely Colin Firth, and it's a great story. It's a wonderful story, and very relevant even for today. It's about courtship and love, and so on. And it's a really, really great read. So many of you might really enjoy Pride and Prejudice. So yeah, quite a challenge. I mean, it's pretty long. The language is obviously a couple of 100 years old, but I think it's certainly accessible, and it's quite easy to get used to. But a really, really great read. A really great read. Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula, is a really weighty novel, and with a very, very complicated plot line and lots of different characters to get to know. But again, is a gripping story and classic Gothic novel as well, and quite racy actually here and there as well. So a fabulous story that has stood the test of time over generations of readers, and is really gripping. And of course, there's that wonderful recent interpretation that was on just over Christmas, which is, by the way, nothing like the text. So don't get distracted and think, oh my God, that was brilliant, because it's so loosely based on the text, you can barely see a resemblance to the story. But anyway, thoroughly recommend Bram Stoker's Dracula, but not an easy read. Yeah, it's definitely one for the more able, I would say. Incredibly interesting, though, to look at from a feminist point of view. And then we've got Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which is a shorter novel, and you could probably get away with reading an abridged version. They have them on Audible, actually, we see from the Boris Karloff image there that you might associate it with a kind of horror story. And in fact, that's what its origins were. It was a horror story. It was a kind of like a ghost story. Shelley came up with a story because they were sitting around trying to think of a tale that would be who could come up with the most terrifying tale, and that's where the story came from. But in fact, it's a beautiful and very moving story, actually, about society and how we treat people, and actually is multi-layered and really interesting, and written by a 19-year-old young woman. I mean, really incredible. So lovely story, and we kind of ask the question in the end of the story: who, in fact, is the real monster? Is it, in fact, Victor, the scientist, that created the monster, or is it the monster himself? So a beautiful story, and really very moving. And then we've got 1984. Those of you that are interested in history might really enjoy it. It's a short read as well, and a dystopia set in the future, is written in the middle of the 20th century by George Orwell. A really gripping story, very interesting. As I said, if you're interested in history, and the women, although the women play minor roles in the story, it's very interesting to look at how these women are portrayed by Orwell, and what that tells us about the society in which he was writing. So that's a good one. Very gripping story, very simple story, easy to read, pretty short, but nonetheless very interesting to look at from the perspective of feminism, and I've had some students get some great marks, full marks on this text. So thoroughly recommend that one as well. And then we've got Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, a very weighty novel. Some of you may have studied it actually at GCSE. but that's fine. You'll be looking at it from a very different perspective, and you might learn something new. If you have studied at GCSE, you then look at it from the perspective of feminism. A beautiful, moving story. And if you can get past Dickens's style, which is a little bit wordy here and there, but not a particularly complicated plot, but a gripping story nonetheless. Great plot line, and so you can follow the adventures of Pip and his trials and tribulations, and then look at it about what it tells us about Victorian society and attitudes to women. And of course, many of you will know and understand an awful lot about that by now, having studied importance of being earnest. So there's great expectations as well. Okay, so 5 novels to choose from, and what do you do now? Well, I guess you just need to get reading and researching. So I would, if any of you have the Audible app, I would think that would be a good chance to start. You can download a sample on Audible of each of those texts. You might want to do that, just sort of get a taster of the kind of style that the authors are writing in. You might want to watch a film or two. I mean, God knows you've got the time at the moment. But obviously be wary about these films, because many of them are quite different to the novels. But it just gives you a feel of the story. And so try and decide on your novel ASAP, and then get cracking reading it. So that's the next thing for you to do. Now that we've tackled a few section C's, and we're going to be moving on to the coursework. So yeah, get reading and making notes. Okay.